It's Friday night, and it's been a long week. And so now you want to try to find a way to relax and unwind and sort of get away from a hectic week. And what better way to do that than go for a night out with your friends, right? And so you end up at a party along with your friends, and you start telling them all what's been happening to you lately. Parties are now lively places to hang out. There's music, there's fun, and a carefree atmosphere. And so, because of the atmosphere, you start to naturally let go of all the anxieties that you have, and you start to feel more relaxed. And so, all the stuff and all the experiences, stuff, and stories in general that's been happening to you lately suddenly all start coming to your mind. And so, you naturally start to be more talkative and start to tell all the stories that you have. So, that's what typically happens at parties. Let's say you're telling them about your week. Let's say you went on a hiking trip the other day where you saw snow melting on a lake, or you saw a beautiful rainbow the other day when you went on the same hiking trip. Now, stuff like this, we all love to talk about in our free time. But the thing is that even though we love to talk about it, there's oftentimes a lot of detail in all this which we are forced to miss out. Take, for example, the shape of this layer of ice. I mean, it's hard to describe what you saw without a good picture of it, right? The second issue that we have is there's a lot of bookkeeping involved typically in all this. So think about how much imagery that you have to keep in mind just to tell something. And the third issue you have is that when you're telling this thing to the other person who's listening to it, he has to have a good imagination to be able to listen to all that. And so if a story is really boring, then you may not even catch his attention. And before you know it, he's drifted off into Wonderland. And so what do? It's more visual than auditory. And so the one thing that is a problem is that he really can't see what you're thinking. That is, there's no visual representation to what you're describing. So the one way to fix that is simply show him what you're thinking about, right? So that's our interaction model right here. And what we are going to do is that we're going to replace this imagery with the help of data. So at first, it's kind of confusing, like, what am I doing exactly, right? But if you think about it, what we have done is that we've actually caricaturized our model of interaction here. At first, it looks a bit like a weird comic, as in he's looking at your thought and you both are continuing to talk as if it's completely normal for him to look at the little bubble on top of your head. But yeah, I mean, that's what a model is. It's a caricaturized version of what we are doing. So this is actually, it's a micro model of the situation. All this time, we've been looking at a party from a micro perspective. That is, we've been looking at an individual interaction. Let's also look at the macro perspective. That is, the aggregate model of all the interactions. Here we have the data flow diagram of a party. Let's just call it right now a party. So now we're going to make a few assumptions here. We're going to assume that, for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that the flow of data is aligned with the natural flow of conversations in a party. So that's just a simplifying assumption that we have made. And now this model appears to be, if you analyze the structure of this model, it appears to be homogeneous. That is, nearly everybody's talking to everybody else all at once. So, but then if that's the case, there'll be situations like somebody's talking to you and you're talking to somebody else, right? I mean, and we know that's not a realistic situation. That's chaos. So if this were the model of party, it'll be like total chaos. So what we'll do is that we'll filter out some of these interactions to come to a much more realistic model. This is known as fragmentation. So what happens is that all these interactions that you saw, they're all gone, and now it appears to be a much more fragmented model. So that means people are typically talking in smaller groups. So it's a much more localized form of interaction that happens within smaller groups, and they're typically within hearing distances. So there's one more layer here that is within the same group, like we're all different. So naturally, what happens is that some of us keep quiet and others listen. So that means it actually follows what is known as a single source, multiple listener model. That is, one person is speaking and all the rest of the people are listening to it. So this is kind of like the abstraction that I created here. This you can say is like a unitary structure that you can say forms the basis of the party. And in this, like typically it's one person speaking and multiple people listening to it. So this is, you can even call it a sort of a mesoscale structure that is something in between the micro and the macro. So considering all these data flows, we wanted to provide a mechanism to be able to facilitate these data flows. So we came up with some ideas for building a mobile application. And the idea behind it was to make this process as seamless and as efficient as possible. So here is the sample design that we generated. So this design is only for illustrative purposes. We're not going to go into the details of this design right now. It's just we're trying to understand the general, rather we're trying to understand the general characteristics of this application. Like what are the characteristics that makes this feasible for this situation? So first thing is that we have made this design visual. Since we're dealing with a visual flow, so the application naturally is much more visual. The second thing is it's real time. Since talking is a real time process, so the data exchange that happens typically is also real time. So naturally, it has to match the format in which it's taking place, right? Third thing is fragmentation. Like we took into account the effect of fragmentation here. That is, there's no point in having a single interface for the entire event. Instead, you should be able to spontaneously create one of these small groups as and when they're required. So the fourth thing is we implemented the single source multiple listener model. So in this, we have tried to follow the natural flow of conversations. And so it's one person controlling the interface of the entire group. Thus, what we have here is the way in which data interacts in a given situation affects the user interface that handles it. That's the idea behind having this application in place. Now that we've gone over some of the models, let's also discuss some of the variations of the model. Like, what are the ways in which we can change this model here and there to create new kinds of use cases? So the first thing we'll consider is the problem of introductions, that is, introducing yourself to people. So let's say you're at a party and you want to introduce yourself to somebody new. So what you can do is that if you can alter some of these data flows, you could potentially get introduced to somebody new. So that's basically sums up the problem of introductions. Obviously, there's a lot of data processing involved here. It's not as simple a problem that I've just described it. You got to have some machine learning algorithms to be able to create those connecting flows. So the other variation that we have considered is connected conversations. That is, since data and conversations can now seamlessly interact, it's possible for us to create new kinds of conversation structures that would not have been possible. Let's say both of you like hiking. So then that's a common interest for both. Now our idea is to be able to sort of get an idea of your common interests and to be able to consolidate all that and to be able to present it to both the users that, hey, look, this is your common interest and this is something that you'd both enjoy talking, basically. So that's what connected conversations are all about, is basically creating those connections that are possible so that people can quickly be able to understand what the other person likes and what the other person doesn't like, so that they can actually socialize much more efficiently. The end.